Evolutionary theory says that many years must have passed for the processes that have evolved life on this planet. According to Charles Darwin, it all started in a warm little pond and would have taken much time for the biological processes to have become what we see today in the world around us. Therefore, they have assumed that the Earth must be 4.5 billion years old or so. The Sun also must be very old to have provided the gravitation needed to bring the particles together that they allege have formed the Earth in the first place. Most secular scientists agree that the processes of the first biology came together and began evolving at around 3 or 4 billion years ago.
Well, there are a number of evidences in the universe that are just inconsistent with the notion that the universe is many, many billions of years old. And in the solar system in particular, there are a number of evidences that indicate that the solar system cannot be 4.5 billion years old, as is commonly alleged in textbooks and in most classrooms.
Secular scientists have gauged the Sun's life to be somewhere in the middle of its approximate life cycle. They have done this by looking at other stars in the universe and comparing them to our Sun, and by calculating the fuel consumption of the Sun.
We can calculate based on what we know about the structure of the Sun, based on very good physics, I might add, that the Sun today ought to be about 40% brighter than it was when it supposedly formed 4.5 billion years ago, about 25% brighter than it was when life supposedly appeared on the Earth about 3.5 billion years ago.
The Sun does indeed grow in energy output due to shrinkage in its core. The hydrogen is being compressed more as time passes. It has been determined that the Sun itself would have actually grown 25% since its purported beginning if it were 4.5 billion years old. That means the Sun would have been 30% cooler at the time that evolutionists say life must have started.
Now, with all the talk about global warming, you might wonder what would happen if you brighten the Sun up just a little bit rather than a lot that we do here. Well, you would make the Earth hotter. And you can run the numbers. I've run them. And the 25% increase since life supposedly appeared would have resulted in about a 17 Celsius temperature increase. And it's interesting enough that the temperature of the day average on the Earth is about 15 Celsius. Which means that when life supposedly began, the temperature was only about -2 Celsius, or about minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That would have been an average temperature. So the Earth would have been a very cold place back then. A good deal of the oceans would have been frozen, and nobody believes that the Earth was ever that cold.
The scientific community has searched the universe for stars similar to our own. The stars that are used as a comparison are called proxy stars, or solar analogs. These young main sequence stars are cool in their output. The core is not efficient because it is uncompressed in its density. The younger stars have been determined to be very violent, with massive outbursts of radiation.
And a lot of major research has gone into trying to find suns at sun-like stars, or what we call solar analogs, that are like the Sun but at different ages than the Sun, and to see what their characteristics were. And so the evolutionary story is that the Sun is 4.6 billion years old. And so it's had a long lifetime, and it's gone through a lot of stages.
These outbursts, as seen in what scientists call proxy stars, would most likely have blown the entire atmosphere away from the Earth, leaving it completely unprotected. And there, much like the planet Mars, it would have remained, a frozen, waterless, lifeless desert. Are there really stars out there that are like our Sun? Is the Sun unique in its function? Scientists who have scanned the universe in search of these solar analogs have had a difficult time finding any.
Something I've cogitated on for a while is I've asked the question, is the Sun a star? And you know, amongst science today, for some time we recognize that the Sun is a star. You look out at night, you see thousands and thousands of faint objects we call stars, and we now know with modern astronomy, reasonably modern astronomy, that these are just distant stars like our own. Our Sun would look like a star if you were far away from it. And that part is fine as far as the science and what we see in the world around us. But I don't think biblically it's a star. I don't think the sun is ever referred to as a star. It's referred to in a different class all by itself. And that leads me to believe that its function is unique, and perhaps its form is also unique. And I think there's some oddities about the sun that are probably unique to the sun, which would suggest some design. For instance, it's got an odd abundance of lithium. It doesn't match any other star out there, which is interesting. I don't have any idea what that means, but I find it interesting that it's not a good match for anything. People have written about, speculated upon what kind of stars, planets could orbit around and support life. And interestingly enough, stars similar to our sun would work pretty well. They've got the right type of radiation coming off to support plant life and yet not be lethal amounts of really dangerous types of radiation. Yet people have, in the last decade or so, have been studying other stars we consider solar analogs, stars similar somehow to our sun, and they find a lot of instabilities on those stars. If the sun were orbiting some of these other stars, then you would have a problem with living organisms or eruptions and flares on these stars. And the sun is not. It's a very stable star, given the type of star that it is. That's interesting. Why is it like that? Well, there's no physical explanation that I'm aware of. But of course, if it's designed for a particular purpose of supporting our life on this planet, then you can begin to understand why it's designed that way.
The present paradigm has struggled to keep the theory of the Big Bang and the ancient Earth intact. However, there are many contradictions and inconsistencies in most theories about our origins. The faint young sun paradox is one major hurdle that has been struggled against for many years.
One interesting point is that young suns have been found to be very, very violent. And so if we go back in the history 3 or 4 billion years to what the sun would be like, the sun would have these violent explosions which would wipe out all life on the earth several times a week. And so about the time the biologists want life to develop on the earth, they have this violent sun.
Evolutionary champion Carl Sagan saw this problem and struggled to solve this contradiction until his death in December of 1996.
Carl Sagan saw this, and it was his last great problem that he tackled. He had to take care of this problem, and he saw it as a major problem. And so a paper was published posthumously by his collaborator, whose last name was Chiba, to explain this effect. And he tried to put in some opposing greenhouse effects and methane atmosphere to block the sun. The problem with his explanation was he was using ammonia as a greenhouse gas, and ammonia breaks down the presence of sunlight. And so he also had to put a thick methane atmosphere in the earth, and we had methane atmosphere for a while there, according to Sagan. And if you think about it, there's a problem with that, because the minute you start allowing the earth to start warming up, then it would break down the ammonia. And so you'd have to have the methane work and the ammonia work almost with an intelligence to match up in a very nice way as the earth was warming up.
Most evolutionists, if they know about the problem, would hypothesize that the amount of greenhouse gases were very high early on in the Earth's atmosphere, and that trapped and held in heat. But as the sun evolved and got brighter, the Earth's atmosphere evolved and lost its greenhouse gases. And over 3.5 billion years, those two effects almost exactly canceled each other out. You have two unrelated processes going in opposite directions and exactly compensating one another. There's a word for that. It's called a miracle. You just don't have that kind of process taking place. So I find it a lot easier to believe that the sun, and hence the Earth, really aren't that old. So I think the young faint sun paradox really tells us that the sun really is not billions of years old at all.
Well, I did my PhD research on the sun, and I got to learn quite a bit about the sun. One of the things that I found out about is called the faint young sun paradox. You see, it's commonly alleged that the sun is 4.5 billion years old, and so is the Earth in the secular time scale. There's a problem with that. You see, as stars age, theoretically, they ought to become brighter because of the change in the mean nuclear density of material in the core as the hydrogen becomes helium, allegedly over billions of years. Physics tells us that the sun ought to become brighter as the core sort of shrinks and it becomes more energetically productive. And so the sun, if you think about it, the sun 4.5 billion years ago would have been much fainter, even 3 billion years ago. Whenever you want to start life on the Earth, allegedly, the sun would have been fainter by 25-30% fainter, and therefore the temperature of the Earth would be much lower. The Earth would be an ice ball, and so how are you going to get life started on an ice ball, you see? If anything, we find from geology that the Earth, if anything, was perhaps a little warmer in the past. We don't find evidence that millions of years ago in the secular thinking that it was an ice ball. So it's actually a problem for the secular scenario, but it's not a problem for biblical creation because over 6,000 years the sun really wouldn't have changed significantly in brightness.
Creationists start with only one assumption, that the Bible is true. The words found on its pages have been given to men by the one who created not just the earth and the sun, but the entire universe. Scripture says that God is the source of all knowledge. Since all knowledge comes from Him, there should be no surprise when we find that science matches perfectly with His words. Men have throughout the ages ignored God and His creation. They suppressed the truth revealed to them in nature. The heavens do indeed declare the glory of God, and there is no voice or language that cannot understand when this revealed glory speaks.
The sun is a creation by God. It has got order and design, and it was made for us. And so we can praise our Savior for that.